778. You are live. What's your name? What's your comment?
Hey, my name is Paul. You hear me, Tim?
Yeah, I got you, Paul. What's up, brother?
Yeah, so I just wanted to discuss with you issues pertaining to identity politics, and I'm glad you're choosing to focus in on it and hone in on this issue, because a lot of these leftists for the longest time have ignored identity politics and have merely framed identity politics as being some sort of liberal wokester thing that doesn't need to be focused in on. But we got to point out the fact that specific identities have had specific experiences within the context of America, especially economically related. One specific identity is being redlined. One specific identity isn't getting the New Deal benefits. One specific identity isn't getting the GI Bill at a significant rate. Therefore, one significant group of people, in accordance to their identity, are being racially discriminated against for decades. Even in a post-1960s world, where you're now getting access to voting rights, or let alone getting access to white-only pie, the specific repercussions of those decades of racial discrimination have now corresponded in the modern inner cities, or otherwise known as the underclass. And it's quite fascinating to me that a lot of these left tubers merely ignore the underclass environments that are found in inner city regions, whether it's Southside Chicago, whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Los Angeles. They'll go out of their way to focus on middle to slightly middle to lower class existence that's found in the Rust Belt states, that's associated with the white working class, but they'll utterly ignore anything and everything pertaining to the underclass environments that are found in racially discriminated environments now known as the inner cities. And I'm glad you're choosing to focus in on this issue and really highlight it, because you got to call out these lefties, and they got to be willing to confront the decades of white supremacy that has now corresponded in structural, racist, environmental conditions that have manifested from decades of white supremacy.
Damn.
I've been really thinking about this issue for a long time, Tim. I'm glad you're focusing in on this issue. You're the only lefty right now, the only lefty that's highlighting these issues. How can you proclaim to be a lefty but ignore underclass environmental conditions that have manifested from decades of white supremacy? And now our white supremacist conditions and our environmental conditions rooted in decrepit education, rooted in decrepit infrastructure, rooted in issues pertaining to housing, rooted in issues pertaining to the job sector. None of these issues ever get highlighted. What was Bernie Sanders' community revitalization program to target the inner cities? It wasn't even to be found. And I like Bernie Sanders. I'm not taking anything away from Bernie Sanders. Right. But where was this community revitalization program to target the inner cities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, Paul, look at it like this, man. Let me look at this. Let me pose this to you. What is the reason why? Why do you think they don't want to talk about it? Why aren't they discussing it? It's obvious it's an elephant in the room, and I appreciate you acknowledging that I'm bringing attention to it. But if you had to, I don't know if we can be certain, but what would be your inclination to why they're not discussing it?
The reason why they're not discussing it, because white supremacy is invisible to them. They don't see white supremacy. They don't see that the decades of racial discrimination have corresponded in these underclass environmental conditions. They don't know that analysis. The most they know is a sort of 1980s and onwards neoliberal analysis where these environmental conditions were impacted by the war on drugs. That's as far as their analysis goes. They don't have the specific nuances and understanding as it pertains to what's corresponded in these environmental conditions, how FDR played a role, how Truman played a role, how even Kennedy to a certain extent played a role, and how we haven't still dealt with these issues and focused in on these issues and targeted these issues. We'll target the Rust Belt state conditions. Trump targeted, Bernie Sanders talked about it, but nobody within any sort of left tube community, let alone even politicians for that matter, are highlighting the underclass conditions because they don't see white supremacy. They want to run away from white supremacy. They don't want to confront the legacy of white supremacy. They're fine living in a world where maybe white supremacy doesn't exist. Maybe we won't have to talk about the death, the pain, the misery, the impoverished conditions in Southside Chicago. Maybe somehow, some way we can just avoid it, just not look at it, right? And then we won't have to deal with it. That's the world they want to live in. But we can't live in that world because that world doesn't exist.
True. You know what, Paul, I appreciate your stance on this, and I admire, the amount of graciousness that you have in your comment and your worldview and the way that you are doing your best not to villainize these people. But I got to tell you, brother, with all honesty, I do not share your optimism for their motives. I believe that they are fully aware of what has happened in this country and how it has impacted black folks. I think they're fully aware that there was a thing called a New Deal, that we did not get it. They're fully aware that we didn't get, take advantage of the GI Bill, was not extended to us. I think they're fully aware of the Homestead Act. I think they're fully aware of discrimination and redlining. I think they have made a calculated decision, Paul, and this is why I've been on a tear, brother, is I believe they know that their audience consists of, and it does include people who are white supremacists, and for them to address these issues would somehow divide their audience, and that would affect their bottom line and their pocketbooks. Now, some people are now coming around. I see them coming around, and maybe they'll be doing some different things. But I don't want tokenism. I want actual. I want them to say it with their chest. I want them to actually dig into these issues and actually mean it. So that's where you and I differ, but at the end of the day, we're at the same point.
I do agree with your analysis in regards that it is intentional. It is intentional. There are intentional components assigned with it. These issues in terms of underclass environmental conditions don't trend on Twitter. They don't trend on CNN. They don't trend on MSNBC. They don't trend, let alone, God forbid, on Fox News. Most of these left tubers go on Twitter, they see headlines on Twitter, and away they go with their discussion. Their analysis doesn't even supersede anything that's not found on Twitter. You have to go beyond Twitter in order to find out the conditions that actually exist in these underclass environmental conditions. And due to the fact that it's not trending, therefore they're afraid and intentionally avoid that issue because their Patreon subscribers don't necessarily want to hear that discussion because they frame it superficially as being identity politics.
There it is.
But when you focus in on the white working class in the Rust Belt states, that's also an example of identity politics. You can't run from identity politics, whether we're talking about the white working class that's been impacted 1980s and onwards, or whether we're talking about African Americans found in underclass environmental conditions, or even indigenous people on indigenous reservations. We can't hide the fact that one identity has corresponded in given access to specific opportunities, especially economically related, that other identities haven't been given. It doesn't trend, so these guys choose not to cover it. It's as simple as that. And instead, what they do then, they just avoid it and frame it as, you don't really need to know about identity politics. It's just a wokester thing on the side. The real stuff, the real news is found on Twitter. The real news is associated with the white working class. And that's what their analysis more or less becomes reducible to.
Man, I love having this conversation with you, Paul. At the end of the day, to me, it's sort of like my segment I did about Bill Maher and his concern about the national anthem being the black national anthem, Lift Every Voice, being sung at NFL games. And he talked about segregation being a problem, like we can't have two national anthems. He's saying that we need unity. And if we have two different national anthems being sung, that shows a disunity. And that's not good. That would be segregation. But what he doesn't want to accept, Paul, and it's similar with these folks on the left or the fake progressives, is that if you really want to cure the segregation, we got to deal with the original sin, and we have to deal with that with a reparation or restorative justice that close the racial wealth gap, give people a a reason to come together by being on the same footing, giving everyone the same type of outcomes in their lives in the pursuit of happiness, which is afforded them in the Constitution. And until you do that, brother, it doesn't matter if we all play the same song, we're going to be dancing a different tune.
Yeah, pretty much, more or less. It's so refreshing to hear that you're focusing in and targeting in on these issues. For the longest time, for years and years, I don't want to specifically call out a lot of these left tubers. You've called them out. You know who they are. For years and years and years, they've been telling their audiences, you don't really need to focus on this identity stuff. All it is just the class stuff. The race stuff doesn't matter. And now they're in many ways being forced to confront this issue due to the fact that issues pertain to critical race theory, let alone George Floyd's death. A lot of these factors have now sort of forced them to at least take some sort of baseline minimal position. And some have at least made an attempt, while others still just continuously just ignore the issue altogether. And the issue pertaining to race doesn't even exist in their intellects. Some haven't even covered critical race theory. Some have even chosen not to even examine it. Therefore, these individuals rightly need to be criticized and called out.
Well, look, Paul, I want to thank you so much for calling up, brother. I appreciate your intellect, your personality on this, your point of view, I should say, on this. I mean, it's very respectful. I got to give you that, and I like the fact that you're so well versed in what's happening here, man. Please don't make this your last time calling up, and we should talk again.
I just want to mention one quick thing before I hang up. I remember you made a video a couple of days ago. You mentioned Tim Wise, you mentioned Dr. Umar Johnson, and at the end you stated, those that know. And unfortunately, most people don't know. All right, thanks for your time, Tim.
Man, thank you, my brother. Give it up for my caller, Paul. Man, that's what I'm talking about. That is why this show is worth so much to me, is because of you guys. And that's a treat, y'all. That sounds like I had a ringer, a planned call. No, I didn't know who this person was, and I'm so glad that they chose tonight to call up because, wow. You know, there have been people, unlike Paul, like Paul was very appreciative. He said it a couple times that I'm making these issues important and I'm focusing on them and I appreciate his acknowledgement of that. I've had people the opposite point of view, where they see these commentators as sort of like sacred cows or sacred Kyles and Jimmys and Crystals and look guys, or Katie's or whatever. Listen guys. If they didn't have audiences that I feel that they are misinforming, then I could agree with you. I could agree with you then. But if you have an audience and basically we're in the same bucket, so to speak, and you're telling your audience that my blackness is not a detriment to my success or my happiness, if you're telling my audience that these discriminating practices that have been perpetuated in this country for the last 100 years are not hindrances to black folks today, if you're giving them this run-of-the-mill about how we could just focus on Medicare for all and somehow that's going to improve my life so much that the homeless folks who are homeless, like black folks are not just homeless because we lack medical insurance. We're homeless because we lack the wealth, the racial wealth gap that exists in America. We're homeless because of a myriad of reasons. And the only one you want to address is the one that we share in common. But for the issues that are distinctive or more pronounced in the black community, you don't want to address those problems. So that's why I have a problem. And it's not a personality thing. It's just they got the audience, they're doing the misinformation, or they're doing the omission, the lying by omission, and someone's got to hold their feet to the fire on it. That's all it is. And I appreciate Paul for understanding that, for getting why that's important to me. And also because I've worked with some of these people for the last couple of years, and I find it as a personal affront. And George Floyd, to me, was the last straw that broke the camel's back. The lack of coverage on the George Floyd case and what that meant. And that whole summer of unrest. If they're going to ignore that, I said all bets are off. I got to go ham. Because that means there's going to be nothing. I mean, they could literally, white supremacists could literally come in my house and drag me out and lynch me. And those motherfuckers wouldn't talk about it. I mean, that's how bad it was. That's how intent they are not to focus on black issues. And once you see that, and you ain't going to look away, it is what it is, you either address it or you're not worth the salt of who you say you are. You're not who you claim to be if you ignore that just because you've been on this person's show or they've been a guest on yours. And you're going to ignore these obvious, not blind spots, intentional bullshit. Let me ask you something. Do they know us? When I say they, I mean the talking heads on cable news. Do they know you? I mean, they talk about the world as if it's a sport. They play political games, report on our pain, rack our brain to feed the stock exchange, but do they know us? Do they know what we care about? Nope. They're too far away. They can't see us. They can't feel us. They can't relate to us. See, when you want to know what's going on in your world, trust someone who lives in your world. Subscribe.